emergency program. These are two phases that communities participate in when they're in the NFIP. The regular program is the final phase of a community's participation. In this phase, the firm in effect, and it has full limits of coverages available. The emergency program is in its initial phase of community's participation. These have limited amounts of coverage and are available while a community is still in its entry-level phase. Determining the flood zone of a building is a key step in determining a property owner's requirement to purchase flood insurance by a lending institution. Flood zones also play an important role in a community's floodplain management efforts to set those minimum building requirements. Most communities have a flood map called FIRM. The FIRM is the official FEMA map of a community. You'll hear the acronym FIRM frequently when we all talk about FEMA flood maps. The maps show the areas of high and moderate to low flood risk in a series of zones, as well as base flood elevations, BFEs. All areas within a FIRM are placed in a flood zone, so everyone in a FIRM is in a flood zone. That's important to remember. Notice the aqua shading area on this map. They represent the special flood hazard areas, in this case the A and V zones, where flood insurance would be required by the lending institution. Then there are the non-special flood hazard areas. The areas with the black dots are called shaded zone X, while any areas with no shading or dots are referred to as unshaded zone X. However, you may find on some older maps that designate the non-special flood hazard areas as zones B and C, instead of the shaded versus unshaded zone X. Let's continue our discussion of the flood zones, because as we mentioned, the zones are grouped into the special flood hazard areas. AE is generally located on the newer flood maps, which replace the old A1 through A30 zones. The same is true for VE zones. Those replace V1 through V30 on the older maps.
Wow.
A zones are generally areas close to lakes, ponds, and rivers, whereas V zones, they're better known as the velocity zones, are wave action flooding. So those are the areas along the coast, or large rivers like Lake Michigan is where you'll find these zones. The Mandatory Purchase Flood Act requires buildings in the special flood hazard area with a federally backed loan to carry flood insurance. The other category we previously mentioned is the non-special flood hazard area, and these zones again include zones B, C, X, and D flood zones. In these non-special flood hazard areas, purchasing flood insurance may not be required by federal law. However, there definitely are some lenders that may require flood insurance. Regardless of whether flood insurance is required or not, NFIP flood insurance is still available for all participating communities in all flood zones. It's also important to remember that flood risk exists even in areas outside the designated SFHAs. A term you'll hear a lot when it comes to flood maps and floodplain management in the NFIP is the base flood elevation. Base flood elevations, or BFEs, is the elevation level of surface waters that result from a flood that has a 1% chance of equaling or exceeding that level in any given year. To put it more simply, it's how high the flood waters may rise according to the flood studies that the maps are based on. It's the expected height of the 1% chance of flood. This tool can be a key consideration for some building, let's say a new home in a flood-prone area. Communities require that the buildings be built at or above base flood elevations in certain areas. BFEs are established at various points within the special flood hazard areas. Notice on this map that the BFEs actually increase. We have the red line showing that this BFE at 730 feet. You can see various points where that number increases and also decreases. As I just said, communities will require certain buildings to have their lowest floors be built at or above those BFEs, so they're better protected from future flooding. But now let's move into defining pre- and post-firm buildings. Pre-firm buildings are those that were built or substantially improved either on or before December 31st of 1974 or before a community's initial firm date, whichever is later. This information can be found by using the community status book to determine the pre- and post-firm status. Now, that date of December 31st of 74 only applies to a select number of communities that had their first firms adopted between 1970 and 1974 as a part of a pilot program. For most communities, you simply look to see if a building was built before the first firm was adopted to determine pre-firm construction. Think of them as a pre-existing pre-firm building. They already existed before a flood map was ever adopted. And different communities have adopted their initial firms at all sorts of different times. On the other hand, if a building was constructed or substantially improved on or after the effective date of a community's initial firm, then this is considered post-firm construction. Post-firm buildings must be built in accordance to the community's flood compliance. These designations can be important when it comes to what is insured in a building and how buildings are constructed, especially in those special flood hazard areas. Next, we're going to shift gears and talk about community rating system discounts. The community rating system, which often is referred to as CRS, is an incentive program that gives communities an opportunity to lower premiums by undertaking flood protections and flood awareness projects and activities. Communities are rated on a scale from 1 to 10, where discounts range from 5% for a Class 9 up to 45% for a Class 1. The CRS discount is applied uniformly within a community regardless of the individual's flood zones. However, buildings not in compliance with the community floodplain management regulations or that have known floodplain management violations are ineligible for the CRS premium discount. And before we leave the topic of community participation, let's talk about one more item, which is the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, or COBRA. The coastal barriers serve as an important buffer between coastal storms and inland areas, often protecting properties on land from serious flood damage. Congress enacted the COBRA to minimize the loss of human life and damage to those natural resources associated with the coastal barriers. In addition to the COBRA system, we also have the Otherwise Protected Areas, or OPAs, which are undeveloped coastal areas established primarily for wildlife refuge, sanctuary, recreational, or natural resource conservation purposes. Additionally, Congress passed the Bolstering Ecosystem Against Coastal Harm Act, the Beach Act. This amended the COBRA and revised the official maps on the COBRAs on November 25th of 2024. This removed nearly 1,000 structures, which are now eligible for NFIP insurance. Buildings located in a system unit under the Beach Act must be constructed, walled and roofed, prior to November 25th of 2025 in order to be eligible to write a policy. All structures built after November 25th of 2025 in these added areas will not be eligible for NFIP coverage. So it's very important to know whether a building in one of these areas was built before or after the area's particular enactment date. Buildings built or substantially improved or damaged after the area's enactment date will not be able to purchase flood insurance. Also, an NFIP policy will not be renewed. However, if it was built before the enactment date, then you may still write an NFIP policy. Also, the most up-to-date COBRA's boundaries can be found at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Mapper tool. Additionally, the Beach Act map viewer solely illustrates the changes that were made to the COBRA by this act. So you can clearly go there and see which areas are identified. There's a link to both of these map viewers in our NFIP resources, which were given at the beginning and will be at the end of the presentation. And with that, we're going to move to our next poll question, number 2.
Can property owners purchase NFIP flood insurance in every community in the United States? Answer A for yes or B for no.
And don't forget to submit your answer once you have chosen yes.
They have to be
or no.
in the required zone.
Looks like we have most everyone having an answer now.
To be in a flood
Close
zone.
that out. And it looks like most people selected no. The answer should be no, because only participating communities can purchase flood insurance.
Right.
So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Melanie to take us through the fundamentals.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Carrie. And we just went over coverages and flood maps, but now's a good time to start talking about the general rules for policy issuance as well as other activities. Let's begin by looking at who can buy flood insurance. Answer to that question is pretty key and pivotal. Who can buy it starts with participating communities. Part of what makes the NFIP work is that communities do have to agree to participate in the program. And as a matter of fact, all areas within a participating community are in a flood zone.
Mm-hmm.
Now we know who can buy flood insurance. How can you help them to access the NFIP? Now, because of the Mandatory Purchase Act, flood insurance is now required in those special flood hazard areas. And we know that those start with A and or V. But more specifically, flood insurance is required if a building or a mobile home located in a special flood hazard area is used as security for a federally regulated loan. Now, we've looked at who can, we've looked at who must buy flood insurance. Why don't we talk about who actually sells flood insurance? And of course, that is you, licensed property and casualty agents. And you have an option as well. You can write policies through the Write Your Own Company, the WIOs, or you can also write them through the NFIP Direct Servicing Agent. And both the WIOs and the NFIP Direct offer identical coverage and rates. Now, the WIO flood insurance program is a partnership between FEMA and private insurance companies, and it actually just allows them to issue and service policies and adjust and pay claims under the standard flood insurance policy under their own brand name. And the majority of flood insurance policies are through the WIO program. So it provides some additional flexibility and some additional options for policyholders. Now, the NFIP Direct, the servicing agent, is contracted with FEMA to sell and service all types of NFIP policies. So it exclusively handles the group flood insurance policies, as well as those severe repetitive loss policies. And of course, then there's you, agents. Policyholders purchase the NFIP flood insurance through licensed insurance agents who will write with one of these participating private insurance companies, or as we mentioned, you can go directly to the NFIP servicing agent. And what we wanted to tell you is that whether you're writing through the WIO or the NFIP Direct, those policies are going to be handled the same. If they're rated the same, if they're rated correctly, regardless of who services that's in. Now, let's begin talking about standard flood insurance
Mhm.
policy because there's actually three policy forms. We see the dwelling form, the
Mhm.
general property form, and the residential condominium building association policy. And we call that the RCBAP form. So the best way to know which policy form to use is just to understand which one applies to what type of building. In
Mhm.
general, the SFIP can only insure one building per policy. Now, if you happen to have one of those instances, maybe where there are multiple located at the same address, just take a look at the How to Write section in the flood insurance manual for further information.
Mhm.
The dwelling form applies to single family homes, but it can also apply to a residential or non residential condominium building or a non condominium residential or non residential building. For example, that would be an apartment building or a residential co op building. You could have a townhouse, a row house. It could be a 2 to 4 family building. Could also be a residential manufactured mobile home. And when it comes to contents coverage for tenants under the dwelling form and the general property form, which we're going to talk about next, those tenants may purchase contents coverage, which includes coverage for building, improvements, and betterments. Now, the maximum amount payable for those improvements and betterments in the building occupied by the policyholder is 10% of the contents coverage amount that's going to be shown on the deck page. Next up is the general property form. This form is pretty versatile in that it has both a residential and a non residential component to it. For example, it's going to cover those non condominium residential buildings with 5 or more units. And every time I say 5, I put up one hand because it's 5 or more units. So think about it like apartment buildings. Again, there's the co ops, there could be dormitories or even those assisted living facilities. But this general property form also covers non residential buildings. So that's things like your office buildings, your houses of worship, your churches, factories, warehouses, and even those agricultural buildings. So it can insure silos and grain bins. And what about those restaurants that we love so much? Those are all considered non residential commercial buildings. And finally, we've got the RCBAP. Now, this one is quite unique as well because it's used to write coverage on a residential condominium building. That's it. And it even has to be written in the name of that condo association on behalf of all of those unit owners because they have a shared interest in that insured building. So, to be classified as a residential condo building, at least 75% or more of that building's total floor area must be for residential use. Now, with this form, contents coverage is for the common areas. So, the RCBAP is the only one of the three policy forms with a co-insurance clause, and we will talk about that as we move forward. And speaking of moving forward, let me introduce you to poll question number 3.
Your client owns a 4-unit apartment building on a beach in Florida and wants to buy flood insurance. Which policy form do you use to write their policy? A, the dwelling form, B, the general property form, or C, the RCBAP form?
So it's the dwelling form.
Okay, let's take a look at poll number 3 answer. It should be A, the dwelling form in this situation, because it is the 4-unit apartment building. All right, I'm going to take over and let's move to types of coverages. Now that we've looked at all the different policy forms and approaches to writing policies, let's look at the 4 types of coverage that can be found in the standard flood insurance policy. These 4 types of coverage will include coverage A, building property, coverage B, personal property, coverage C, other coverages, and coverage D, the increased cost of compliance. Keep in mind that the standard flood insurance policy is a single peril property policy that will pay for direct physical loss by or from flood. The emphasis will be on direct physical loss. For coverage A, we're going to discuss and define the definition of a building, review other building types, look at additions and extensions, and review coverage items. Let's begin by talking about coverage A, building property. In order to do that, we need to first define what a building is in the NFIP. The standard flood insurance policy's definition of a building is rather broad. To be an eligible building, it has to have 2 or more rigid outside walls, a fully secured roof, and to be affixed to a permanent site. Buildings must be anchored to resist flotation, collapse, or lateral movement, and at least 51% of their actual cash value must be at and above ground level. That's all it takes to be defined as a building. Hopefully you were listening, because we are going to pop into the next poll question, poll number 4. Poll number 4 will pop up in just a moment, and look at this photo and see if this is an eligible building that has a fully secure roof with 1 wall. Once it pops up, you can answer A for yes or B for no.
Didn't pop up.
You might need to scroll down in the poll to get the yes and no options. And don't forget to hit that submit once you've made your selection. All right, it looks like we have our answer. And again, hopefully everyone selected no, because as we just discussed, the definition must have 2 walls connected to that roof. And this one in this picture and instance has the 1 wall. Next, let's look at detached garage. The dwelling form, the only dwelling form, has a special provision that applies just to detached garages. The dwelling form says that at the insured's option, at the time of loss, a policyholder can extend up to 10% of the policy's coverage A limit over to the detached garage. Now I want to emphasize that this 10% applies only to detached garages and not to any other type of outbuilding. This is not an additional coverage amount. When it's used, it reduces the building's coverage limit. If they want more coverage, they have the option to insure the detached garage separately. And the policy is specific about what type of detached garage it does not apply to. So this won't apply to any detached garage that is used or held for use for residential, business, or farming purposes. So let's move from detached garages and now talk about additions and extensions. Now that we know the different ways of a building is defined in the NFIP, what about additions and extensions to those? Well, each policy form ensures additions and extensions attached to and in contact with the building by means of a rigid exterior wall, a solid load-bearing interior wall, a stairway, an elevated walkway, or a roof. In this picture, you can see an elevated walkway as our example. The insured also has the option to insure additions and extensions connected by any of these methods separately. To do so, the flood insurance application must clearly describe the additions and extensions to be insured separately and give all the necessary rating information. Let's look at a couple more examples. Here we have the solid load-bearing interior wall, a connection by a stairway, and then the obvious roof line. Now let's take a look at the eligible building definition, which also includes certain mobile homes and travel trailers. Both must be built on a permanent chassis and affixed to a permanent foundation. That must be poured masonry slab or foundation walls, or maybe piers or block supports, either of which support the mobile home or travel trailer, so that no weight is supported by the wheels and the axles. They must also be anchored to resist flotation, collapse, or lateral movement. It's important to note that manufactured mobile home is not a modular building. Modular buildings construction is regulated by the same local and state rules that apply to site-built buildings. Next, we're going to talk about buildings under construction. Buildings under construction can also be eligible buildings. Each SFIP form provides wording that allows a policy to be issued even before the building is walled and roofed. But if the building does not have at least 2 rigid exterior walls and a fully secured roof, it's not eligible for coverages when construction stops for more than 90 days, or if the lowest floor is below the basement elevation. More specifically, the lowest floor, including the basement floor of a non-elevated building, or when the lowest floor of an elevated floor of an elevated building that is below the BFE in an SFHA A zone, or below the BFE adjusted to include the effective wave action for a V zone. Those are not included. Refer to the flood insurance manual for more specific zone information and requirements. And until the building is walled and roofed, the building's deductible is doubled. It does cover materials and supplies while they're contained in an enclosed building on premises or adjacent to the premises. Once construction is complete, it's important to remember then the policy must be endorsed to reflect that the building is no longer under construction and update any other rating variables as needed. These policies will not renew automatically if the building is still under construction at the time of renewal. An application form or recertification questionnaire will be required to renew the policy. Now here is a list of items that appear in the policy that are issued under Coverage A, Building Property Limits. This is not meant to be a comprehensive list of building property insured, but it really illustrates is these items will always be considered building property rather than personal property. Notice how built-ins like the dishwasher, microwaves, as well as carpet permanently installed over unfinished flooring are considered building property. Central air conditioners, awnings, fire sprinkler systems are also building items. While blinds are considered building property, drapes are not. Here we have additional building items, including the hot water heater and solar water heaters. light fixtures, ovens, and ranges. This also includes permanently installed cupboards, bookcases, cabinets, paneling, wall mirrors, and etc. While refrigerators are considered building property, freezers are considered personal property, which we'll talk about next. Okay, now let's switch from the topic of building coverage and look at coverage B in the SFIP, which is personal property coverage. And I need to make a distinction here between how personal property is handled under the dwelling form versus the two other policy forms. Under the dwelling form, the insured's personal property is insured inside a building. In fact, it can be inside any building, as long as the building is at the described location. And by described location, the NFIP means the location described on the deck page. On the other hand, under the general property and RC-BAP forms, the contents must be inside, but not just inside any building. It must be in a fully enclosed, insured building. So the additional leeway given to the insured under the dwelling form does not apply to the two other forms. This slide is similar to the coverage A items that we saw a couple slides ago. This gives the overview of personal property items as they're listed on the dwelling form, as well as the two other policy forms. Notice that there are slight differences between these lists. Once again, these lists are not meant to be comprehensive. What they do is illustrate to policyholders that certain items will always be considered personal property items as opposed to being building property. For example, we've got portable or window air conditioning units are personal property items under all three forms. But we saw on the coverage A list that central air conditioners are treated as building property. Also, carpet. Carpet can be either coverage A or B depending on how it's installed. As we saw earlier, carpet permanently installed over an unfinished floor is coverage A. Carpets not permanently installed over unfinished flooring or over a finished floor is coverage B. Some other personal property items include clothes washers, dryers, portable microwave ovens, portable dishwashers, freezers, and cookout grills. It is important to note, though, that this cookout grill example will only be covered if it is stored inside the building at the time of loss. In addition to everything listed under the dwelling form, the general property and RC-BAP form includes outdoor equipment and furniture stored inside the insured building, along with ovens and the like. It's important to remember that these items are covered even if they're stored inside and insured the building at the time of loss. If they're stored in an enclosure, please be sure to see the policy section regarding coverage restrictions. And now we have moved on to our next poll question number 5. For poll question number 5, it is which of the following items are not covered under coverage A, building? Is it A, drapes, carpet permanently installed over finished flooring? B, light fixtures, plumbing fixtures, refrigerators? Or C, central air conditioners, garbage disposal units, permanently installed bookcases? Be sure to submit your answer once you're done. Right, it's looking like most people are getting finished here. And again, this one's important to remember which items are not covered under coverage A, building. All right, the answer here is A. the drapes and the carpet not permanently installed. Because remember, the carpet permanently installed must be over unfinished flooring to be considered coverage A. And with that, I am going to kick it back over to Melanie to take over for the next little portion.
All right, and thank you so much, Carrie. And y'all are doing a really great job of coming in on these poll questions. And this is how we make sure that you are engaging with us, so don't miss that. Now, one other thing that you can do is you have a Q&A. So if a question pops in your mind, just go ahead and you can ask us, and we'll be more than happy to assist. So with that, what we're looking at here is the definition of a basement. And we're going to explore which items are insured. Now, let's just take a look at the definition itself at the top, because the wording is exactly what appears in the definition section of each of the three standard flood insurance policy forms. And basically, what it says is that a basement is any level of a building where the floor are level on all sides. So it really doesn't matter if someone is living there or if they're working there. They may even call it something like a sunken living room. If that floor is below ground on all sides, then it does meet the NFIP definition of a basement. And this definition also points out that it could be something very simple like a sunken room. When I think of sunken rooms, I think about a cellar, like a CELLAR. Some of you may remember houses used to have that type of room, but something you might not also consider can meet this definition. Take a look at the photo that's on the right-hand side for this example. It's one more thing, in case you're wondering. Walkout basements, they do not have a floor that's below ground on all sides. As a matter of fact, walkout indicates that you can step out the patio door and you can land right there at ground level. So it doesn't meet that definition of below ground on all sides. Now, the photo on the left, you can tell, has a basement entrance. And so it is, in fact, below ground level on all sides. So the reason why this is really so important is because it's an understanding that when buildings are below ground level, there are some limitations as well as some restrictions that will apply. And it looks like my screen may be frozen at this time. If I could get some technicity. Okay. Give us just one moment. We've got a little bit of technical difficulty. Not to worry, we will get back on track. We were going to be heading into a 10-minute break here shortly. So when we get the presentation back in, we might just have to shave off a minute or two so that we can keep ourselves right on time for your session.
Melanie, I think you had a great idea. I think this might be a good time to take that 10-minute break. And we'll get everything back up and running. It looks like it's 11:02 Central Standard Time. So if everyone can be back at about 10 minutes, which would be 11:12 Central Standard Time, or 12:12 Eastern Time. We'll see you then.
Okay.
All right, we'll see you then.